Good morning. So we're up to Siman Shin Chof Beis, up to Sif Dalet. Says the Machaba. Ochle behema ein bohem mishum tikun kli. You've got food which is set aside for animals. There's no problem of tikun kli. Lefichach, and therefore, mutter liktoim afilu besakin. You're allowed to trim, even with a knife, kash, teven, straw, or stubble, or hay, or something. For lach, so it's shinov. If this is animal fodder, I'm allowed to take a knife and just trim and make a little toothpick or something like that. Avol kisem she'enoi oichel behema. But if you've got a bit of wood or something which is not oichel behema, afilu litlei kedei lach, so it's shinov asa. Because then you've got a problem with muktzah, and then it's to take it and to make it into a toothpick is asa. So if it's meichel behema and it's therefore muchen, it's okay to cut and to shape, but not if it's not meichel behema. Says the Mishnah Berurah Sif Cotton Tess. Ochle behema rotzolema davashe roy lachilas behema. Something which is fitting for them. Okay, not like I said, not that you've set it aside specially for them, but it's roy for them to eat. For example, softwoods, the animals could eat it. There's no shame kli on it because it's set aside for animal food. Mishum tikun kli, muta af betiltel, and you're allowed even to touch it. The dava haroi lachila muchen hu lekol hatzorich, because if it's set aside for that, then it's muchen for every particular need. Okay, lefichach, and therefore, so carry on. Lefichach, look at this. Yud Aleph. V'yesh severin the dafka. So the Machaba says you're allowed to take a knife and trim it and to do what you want. V'yesh severin. Maybe this is going to calm you down. Yeah, Charlie. The dafka kagoin zeh sha'isem menu kli betchila lo shaykh tikun kli. So what's allowed over here for you to make this thing into a kli? I'm going to use it a toothpick or for some other purpose. Aval im mesakin kli ha'asu kvar bedvar oichel. Then not. So, for example, what does that mean? So, for example, I've got a kli, and I want to take a bit of food and cut food and sort of fill it into a little hole that I've got in an existing kli. That's not allowed. But to fashion the kli in the first place would be allowed, right? So that would be perhaps a qualification on it. Shaykh was tikun kli. So again, what have you said? The Mechaber is saying in this sif that if you've got oichel behema, which is usable for an animal, is not muktzah, and therefore I can touch it, I can do anything, and I can even trim this bit of food. I've got a bit of hay, for example, and I could trim it to fashion it into a toothpick and use it as a toothpick. There are yesh severin, the Mishnah Berurah says over here, that if I've got a kli itself which needs a little bit of filling, I can't take that animal food, trim it, and fill that other kli. That's already a bridge too far. But to use it just to make it a first stage into a kli for my own purpose, that would be allowed. Okay, that's the Ran ve'tiku b'nei b'chai odem v'ayim nishadem the day yesh b'zeh chiyuv chatas. Okay, afilu b'sakin, even to take a knife and do that would be okay. So it says in Mishnah Berurah Yud Beis v'afilu hu mak mid alamida. Even if I want to make it into a particular size, ein bozer shum chashash issa machmas machatich kiven the dova ichelhu, because at the end of the day this is considered an item of fooding. So it needs a bit of a hezbollah. Why is that? You're obviously worried about that. Why? So if you look at note 15, it gives the first sentence there. He says, because this is considered food, and therefore changing the shape of the food doesn't change its status of teras oichel. And you're simply just you're just using the food. You're not changing its status, and it was previously animal food. Since then it's also animal food. All you're doing is just shaping it for your particular convenience. Okay, weiter in the Mishnah Berurah Yud Gimel. Afilu litlei kedei lachzes beishinov is also. But if it's not animal food, then to shape it in any way would not be allowed, because you've got a problem with muktzah. Says the Mishnah Berurah Sif Cotton Yud Gimel, afilu litlei rotzolema afilu netilas stam beli katima, even taking it stam without trimming it, also mishum muktzah kasharitzim. So if it's not animal food, then it would be also like any other pieces of wood or things like that. For kolshkenim yirtze lekotzme kedei lachsas v'shinam, and certainly it would be also if the piece of wood is not animal food, then certainly I can't trim it to make a toothpick lachsas v'shinam the also mishum shvus to kein tikkun kli, because it's some form of tikkun kli. What about taking a match? Would you be able to take a match and use that as a toothpick? It must be, I don't know, the matches I see are pretty big, and therefore you've got to have a pretty big hole in your teeth, a pretty big gap. But let's say it's a thin. Sometimes you get a toothpick match which is like it's broken off at the bottom, and you've got it's a sharper point. Could you use that as a toothpick? So he says in 16, a very interesting application of Hilchas Muktzah. V'lachzes eshin of begafrar with a match. Kosov Tehilas David sheitochin shemuta is allowed. Why? What's the svara? What is the status of a match in Hilchas Muktzah? Kivin shelechayre nechshav hanifred keklisha melachta leissa. That's what a match is, a klisha melachta leissa, and therefore I can't touch it on Shabbos. However, klisha melachta leissa is mutter letalta letzarech gufay. So just like I can take my hammer to open the walnut on Shabbos, it's a klisha melachta leissa, but if it's for letzarech gufay or letzarech mekoma, it's allowed. Well, so too, if I've got a match which is a klisha melachta leissa, if I want to use it letzarech gufay, for example, as a toothpick, that's allowed.
You're allowed to use a toothpick as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's the only thing I'll be careful is not to cause bleeding. Yeah, but that would be okay. All right, weiter in the Mishnah Berurah. V'dafka, I'm 1, 2, 3, 4 lines down, last word on the line. V'dafka im yiktemenu biyad. So this is specifically if you do it by hand, so when we said that this bit of wood is not animal food, and therefore it's muktzah, and you can't do it, when is it also midrabanan? When you sort of break it, you fashion it with your hand. Because men of a kli, but if you start getting chisels and files and other things out, and you make it with a kli, and you fashion into this perfect toothpick, or into a lock to open a key, to open a door, then you've done a definite melacha gemura. Fine. Also, so then it would not be allowed to make it into a toothpick after yesh b'zeh mishum kavod abrius, even though there could be kavod abrius, right? Because maybe it's you've got a bit of meat or something in your teeth, and it could be unpleasant to talk to people, and it's embarrassing for you, and therefore there's possible kavod abrius heterim. Shepam shenira bosa shebena shenai. Sometimes a bit of meat can appear between your teeth, lachutz from the outside, people can see it. Ugnai hulayin is a bit embarrassing for me. Afal pikein also. Because you should have prepared a toothpick before Shabbos, you should have known about it. And therefore, since the whole svara is that it's also because I covered up bris normally is doiched drabanan, and therefore it should be okay if you sort of pick away a little bit of wood and you make it into a toothpick. That's a drabanan, as we said above. You're not using a kli to make it into a toothpick, and therefore that should push aside the issa covered up bris should push aside the issa of fashioning this kli midrabanan. So why isn't it? Because you should have prepared it before Shabbos. Therefore, if you were invited to a meal on Shabbos, and you couldn't prepare your toothpicks before Shabbos, then you'd be allowed to. If there's nothing else to use. But because but in a situation where there's no gnai, then it would not be allowed. So just to summarize what we said, that to take the Mechaber has said in Shin Chof Beis Sif Daled that anything which is Eichel Behema, there's no problem with muktzah, you can make it into a toothpick or into fashion into some other kli, no problem. If, however, it's not usable for an animal, it's very hard wood or something like that, then it's muktzah, and certainly to make it into a toothpick would not be allowed. He says, what if it's if you make it into a toothpick? If you do it with your hands, it's only an issa drabanan of tikkun kli. But if you do it with a kli, then of course it's an issa deraisa. But if you do it with your hands, it's an issa drabanan. So for kavod abriya's purposes, surely it should be okay. So we should have done it yesterday. But if in a situation where you couldn't have done it yesterday, for example, you got the invitation today, and then I forgot my toothpicks, then that might be allowed. That would be allowed. Okay, seif hey. You're allowed to take pieces of wood, to touch pieces of wood, in order to smell them. Imagine you've got these different types of smelling fragrant pieces of wood. And to take them on Shabbos, they're not muktzah, and you can actually take them to smell them. Or wave in front of a chayla, to sort of reinvigorate him. Or when you can sort of rub them in order to be meriach. Echot kashim ve'echot rakim, whether they're soft or hard pieces of wood. Says the Mishnah Berurah Test 12, mutar l'taltel, d'lo maksadaitek me'elu ha'itzim me'kara, because the whole point of muksa is you've put them out of your mind. But these things, they've got a function on Shabbos, and therefore you haven't. L'choyle hu adin lebari, so too for a healthy person. This is the normal way of doing it. You sometimes put this sort of air freshener type of thing near the choyle to give him a bit of chiyus. You cut it and then you roll it. You sort of roll it between your fingers to sort of invigorate it, to let the smell emerge. And therefore katima is also an issue of cutting. When you cut it, it's often going to be a bit more moist to the point of the cut, and therefore the smell will emerge. Many achronim say that which we allow to cut or to trim, the koshim, hainu dafka biyad, v'lo bekli. Afu dekaitim rak kadei lo riach, even if you do it with your hand and not with a kli. Afu kotim rak kadei lo riach, even if you're doing it just to smell, ve'enim mechaven klalos as a kli, and even though you don't plan on making it into a kli. V'lekach also ligdem hadas b'sakin, and therefore comes Sukkot time and you've got hadassim, you're not allowed to cut the hadassim. Let's say you've got some spare hadassim, you can't cut them with a knife because the gezerah you might come to cut other pieces of wood or to trim it to use as a toothpick. Or you're taking a kli to fashion a toothpick, as we said before, you're going to be chayiv. Kanal b'sif kot yud gimel. Va'afilu b'yad ein mutar liktem b'koshin rak lahoriach. Even that is only allowed to smell it, not for anything else. But to fashion a kli with a kli is not allowed. Echot koshim, whether they're hard or whether they're soft pieces of wood, yudches, hainu afilu koshim she'enim ru'im klal l'machal behema. Even if they're not machal behema at all, afilu hachim mutar lekatom lefashech bohem al masha yetza. Even if they're not animal fodder, you can still use your hands to rub them and to make a nice fragrance. Bein shepeshech eitz godly cotton, whether you're using a small or large piece of wood. But also so you can't sort of put this sweet smelling wood or whatever it is, branch, and roll it onto your clothes, because that's called moilid reach, and that's not allowed. But to just rub your fingers on it so it smells nice, and the smell of the stick or something like a cinnamon stick, if it's a bit dry and you want to roll it and now you leave it in the room and it's got a nice smell, that would be allowed. But to roll it on your clothes would not be allowed. If you take a quick look at the 19 and 20, 19, what is the issa of moilid reach? He says 19, v'tam ho'issa lo'ilid reach kosav lekamon, mipnei she'ha'ledes dova chodosh kroiv l'asiyas melacha. Creating a new item is close to being like a melacha. And therefore, if you roll this, let's say, cinnamon stick into your jacket, it's as if it's a tikkun kli. You've sort of improved and made it's like you're making a new kli. And then, what if you've already got a smell in that kli already? Let's say you've got some material, and that's, for example, let's say your esrog is wrapped in material. You're allowed to put an esrog in material on Shabbos, or Yontif, and you put it back in your esrog box. You want to protect it, but it's going to create a nice smell in that material. You take the esrog out, the material will have a nice smell of esrog. So if you look at 20, it says, it's already, you've got a beged which already has a smell in it, and you just want to add extra smell, it's not allowed. And we call Mokum Misha your esrog munach big day for noitli mimenu because of Shom Shemut Latir lebeged levisha in a moisif reach al reach Chaim.
Interested in moisif.
Yeah, true. So if you've got a new beged, true. But if you've got a new beged, then inevitably, you are going to cause the new beged to have it. But if you're just returning it to the beged that you previously kept the esrog in, that would be okay. But you're not being moisif reach. That's okay. Okay, let's just finish off. Va'agav, I'm just about 5 or 6 lines before it gets wide. Va'agav da'arina b'shulchan aruch l'inyan chituch uktima. Since the Shulchan Aruch is talking about cutting and trimming, be'inyan ochle behema va'itze b'samim, that's what we discussed today. Na'atik nami b'zeh din meleches mechatich b'shadvarim. I'm going to just mention a few halachas about chituch on Shabbos. Aleph, If you cut leather on Shabbos, and you're cutting it to size, whether it's wood or metal, or even feathers, if you cut it to size with kavana, that is what chituch is. Chituch, the definition is cutting to size. But if you're cutting something in a destructive way, or without care for exact size, then potter, then there's no deraisa. How great it is that the Nevi'im in Nehemiah say, business, you're not actually doing anything. If I want to sell my car to you, and we talk about it in the back of shul, not in the back of shul, let's say in the hallway outside of shul, and what am I doing already? I'm not doing any melacha. We start negotiating the price for my car, but there's no contract, there's no writing. But Nehemiah came along and said, "Gezer mekach umemka, you can't do." Because it could come to a chiyuv chatas. If I'm selling something, and you might want to cut the item, you want to see a sample of the material I'm selling you. Last night I was at Shabbos and I was sitting with the fellow. He's in the shmatza business, right? So imagine he takes out his thing. He goes, "You want to see a sample of some of the material I've got?" He could cut a little bit lefi midasei to Chaim mishum mechatich. So therefore, Chazal made, that's one of the reasons why Chazal made a gzeira of mekach hamemka. The other is shtaris, you're going to come to rights and things like that. Okay, base. The second point in the Shabbat regarding chituch. Ein meleches mechatich sheyesh shaykh ba'achlin. Cutting does not apply to food. Okay, that's quite an interesting klal. Or kamesha kosavnu le'el b'sif cotton new base, which shouldn't be a surprise, but I suppose it's worth. Mishnah felt it was necessary to say. Gimel. In meleches mechatich hu davka b'kli or afilu b'yad. Is chituch, cutting on Shabbos, is an issa only with a kli or even by hand? So ayin b'mashe kosavnu be'halacha, the toli b'kol dover lefi inyona. It depends on the context. The dover shedak lach dafka b'kli. If you have something which is normally cut with a kli, ein chayiv ki in b'kli. You're only going to be chayiv if you use a kli. For dover shedak lafrida b'chayad, if you have something which you can separate with your hand, chayiv gam ken afilu b'yad. Then that would also be a deraisa if you use your hand to cut it up. And even if you use the alternative, you use your hand when you could have, you normally would use a kli, still there will be an issa drabanan. If you cut a bit of wood to fashion a toothpick, chayiv bazeh mishum tikun kli l'das harash, v'l'das harash mishum mechatich. It could be this chayiv twice. If you take a knife and you fashion from a bit of wood a toothpick, so according to the Rosh, you're going to be chayiv because of tikkun kli, and according to the Rambam, the issa is chituch and possibly also tikkun kli. Okay, we'll leave it there. Mr. Shem will finish off on Monday. Sure.